Hey guys, how's it going? Hope you're doing well. My name is Crown, and today I'm going to read you some very interesting stories that I hope that you're gonna love. And now, without further ado, let's go!
Back in the 1960s, when I was just a young woman with big dreams, I was determined to make something of myself. I studied hard, focusing on engineering and metallurgy. It wasn't easy being one of the few women in my field, but I persevered. My hard work paid off when I landed a job at the country's largest steel mill. Not just any job, mind you. I became the first female rails quality controller in the entire facility. Now, you might think that was a cushy position, but let me tell you, it came with its own set of challenges. In those days, having a good job meant you lived comfortably, but it also meant you were under constant scrutiny. One wrong move, one hint of disrespect towards the authorities, and you could lose everything. Your job, your freedom, even your life. But I wasn't about to let fear hold me back. I took my job seriously, maybe too seriously, for some people's liking. My boss, in particular, was a real piece of work. He was as incompetent as they come, always signing documents without reading them. The man was in charge of a crucial department in a steel mill, and he couldn't be bothered to read what he was putting his name on. I tried to reason with him, I really did. I politely asked him to read the documents before signing them, explaining that we were getting contradictory orders. But he brushed me off, claiming he knew very well what he was signing and telling me not to bother him. This went on for months. One day he'd sign off on shipping 10 tons of rails to another city, and the same day he'd approve a document saying those same rails should be kept for pickup the next day. It was maddening. I kept trying to get through to him. I pleaded with him not to sign anything until he'd read it, but he just repeated that he knew what he was doing and told me to stop pestering him. It was like talking to a brick wall. But then, one day, I'd had enough. We received a letter from the governing authorities asking for some documents to be sent again. Now, mind you, we'd already sent these papers a month ago. That's when I hatched my plan. I drafted a response. Oh, it was a thing of beauty. I wrote, "Ladies and gentlemen, we have sent you this document a month ago. If your papers are in so much of a mess that you can't find a simple document, then I suggest you start smooching up to us instead of giving us a hard time." I knew it was risky, but I was at my wit's end. I placed it on my boss's desk, nestled among his usual pile of papers. As expected, he signed it without a second look. I made a copy, pocketed the original, and left the stamped copy on his desk, making it look like it had been sent. When he finally realized what he'd done, all hell broke loose. He chased me through half the steel mill, yelling threats. He shouted that he would kill me and asked if I knew what I had done. Then, as if a switch had flipped, he started begging. He offered me a raise, promising anything if I wouldn't send the letter. I kept walking, letting him stew in his own juice. Finally, he fell to his knees, tears streaming down his face. He begged for mercy, pleading with me not to send the letter. That's when I turned around, looked him dead in the eye, and pulled out the original letter from my pocket. His eyes widened. I asked him if he would read what he was signing from now on. He nodded frantically, relief washing over his face. From that day forward, he scrutinized every document that crossed his desk like his life depended on it. And in a way, it did. He never dared to question my methods or competence again. In fact, he started relying on me more, often asking for my input before making decisions. It wasn't long before word spread about the incident, and I gained a reputation as someone not to be trifled with. I used my newfound influence to mentor and support other female colleagues. Slowly but surely, we started seeing more women in positions of power within the steel mill. Sometimes a little risk is worth taking, especially when you're fighting for what's right. After years of working as a journalist in the big city, I decided it was time for a change of pace. I'd saved up enough to buy a modest house in a nice subdivision, thinking it to be the perfect place to settle down and maybe start a family someday. Little did I know, I was stepping into a hotbed of petty power struggles and bureaucratic nonsense. When I was checking my mailbox one sunny afternoon, there, stuck to the post, was a flyer that caught my eye. It was from the guy who'd bought the model home at the entrance of our subdivision, and he was basically telling us that our HOA dues were being used to sue him over a fence. A fence? Apparently, the builder had put up this nice chestnut rail fence around the front yard of the model home when it was built. The new owner who'd just moved in didn't think anything of it. But then, out of nowhere, a group of HOA officers showed up at his door and told him he had 24 hours to take down the fence or face a lawsuit. Talk about a warm welcome to the neighborhood, right? Now, I'd already had my own run-in with these HOA busybodies, so I decided to swing by the guy's house and see what was going on. When I got there, I introduced myself and asked him about the situation. I greeted the neighbor and explained that I lived down the street. I mentioned seeing the flyer about the fence issue and asked him what was going on. The neighbor expressed his frustration, saying the HOA people were out of their minds. He explained that he had just moved in and now they were threatening to sue him over a fence that was already there when he bought the place. I told him that didn't sound right and asked if he had checked the covenants. The neighbor looked confused and asked what I meant by covenants. I explained to him that anything existing on the property when he closed on the house should be grandfathered in, meaning the fence was perfectly legal. I even showed him where it said so in the HOA covenants. The neighbor expressed surprise and gratitude for this information, admitting he had no idea about this rule. I told him it was no problem and mentioned that I worked as an editor at the local newspaper. I asked if he would mind if I wrote an article about this whole situation. The neighbor enthusiastically agreed, hoping it might knock some sense into the HOA tyrants. The neighbor, it turned out, was a retired Army colonel. He told me he would have taken down the fence if they'd just asked nicely, but he wasn't about to be pushed around by a bunch of power-tripping civilians. The neighbor compared his experiences, saying he had dealt with difficult people in the military, but these HOA folks were worse. He declared he wasn't backing down without a fight. I headed back to the office and pitched the idea to my managing editor. He loved it, and we decided to turn it into a whole series about HOAs and the little Hitlers who run them. We ran articles for 7 weeks straight on the editorial page, and let me tell you, it caused quite a stir in our little community. While we were running the series, the court case about the fence went ahead. I made sure to keep in touch with the colonel for updates. I asked the neighbor how the court case had gone. The neighbor excitedly told me that they had won the case. He explained that the judge had ruled in their favor and even made the HOA pay for his legal expenses. I expressed how fantastic that was and commented that the HOA board must be fuming. The neighbor confirmed this. That chestnut rail fence is still standing proud 36 years later, a constant reminder of the time a retired colonel and a nosy journalist took on the HOA and won. But the story doesn't end there. After our series ran, something unexpected happened. People from all over the county started reaching out with their own HOA horror stories. It turns out our little subdivision wasn't the only one dealing with overzealous board members. One day, I got a call from a woman in a neighboring development. The caller mentioned reading my articles about the fence incident and told me I wouldn't believe what her HOA was trying to do. I expressed curiosity and asked her to tell me more. The caller explained that her HOA was trying to force everyone to paint their houses the same shade of beige. She complained that it made their development look like they were living in a giant cardboard box. This call sparked an idea. I decided to organize a town hall meeting for all the frustrated homeowners in the area. The turnout was incredible. People from at least a dozen different HOAs showed up, all with their own tales of ridiculous rules and petty enforcement. I addressed the crowd, pointing out that it was clear we were all facing the same problem. I explained that these HOAs had forgotten they work for us, not the other way around, and declared it was time we reminded them. That night, we formed a coalition to push for HOA reform across the county. We drafted proposals for more transparent decision-making processes, limits on the HOA's power to sue homeowners, and mandatory mediation before any legal action could be taken. Over the next few months, we attended every city council meeting, wrote letters to our state representatives, and kept the pressure on through continued media coverage. Slowly but surely, things started to change. One by one, HOAs across the county began adopting our proposed reforms. The more reasonable board members, realizing the tide was turning, started working with homeowners instead of against them. Even our own HOA underwent a major shakeup, with several of the most militant members resigning in disgrace. I never would have guessed that a simple flyer on my mailbox would lead to all this, but I'm glad it did. A few years back, my life took an unexpected turn when a close friend of mine tragically passed away in a motorcycle accident. It was a tough time for everyone involved. His wife had been watching our son a few days a week while my wife worked, and my parents opened their home to his out-of-town family during the difficult days that followed. As winter approached in our northern state, I realized my friend's widow needed her snow tires put on. My dad asked if I could take care of it for her, to spare her the trouble during this challenging time. Of course, I was more than happy to help. I got her keys and headed to her house to change the tires. When I was setting them out, I noticed something alarming. One tire had a huge bubble on the sidewall. I found the paperwork, always keep that stuff with your car folks, and saw the tires were less than a year old. Armed with the paperwork and the damaged tire, I headed to the shop where they were purchased. Now, this wasn't just any tire shop. It was a big deal in our state with locations all over. What's more, the accident had happened right outside this one shop. It was so bad that they had to close for a couple of hours during the investigation. My wife, sister, and I went in to get the tire replaced. I asked for the manager by name. I knew him well because my family and friends had been using this shop for years. I approached the manager and explained that I needed to speak with him about replacing a defective tire. When he asked what the problem was, I explained the situation in detail. I showed him the paperwork and even offered to pay any fees, emphasizing that the tires were clearly under warranty and this one was definitely defective. His response made my blood boil. He flatly refused to help, stating that since I wasn't the person named on the paperwork and that person had unfortunately died, there was nothing he could do. He coldly added that only the deceased could claim the warranty. Shocked by his callousness, I asked if he was serious and questioned if that was really the kind of person he wanted to be, reminding him that this man had died right outside their shop less than a week ago. The manager remained unmoved. He simply restated that it was company policy and not his problem. He suggested that if I wanted, I could buy a new tire. I was so angry I could barely see straight. I glared at him and warned that he'd regret this decision, as I had a big mouth and would tell everyone I knew about this incident. And that's exactly what I did. First, I drove across town to a different shop. This one was used by my company for all their fleet needs. I walked in and happened to meet the owner. I asked the owner if he was aware of the recent accident. He acknowledged that he was and expressed sympathy for the family. I then explained what I was trying to do with the defective tire and mentioned that I was willing to buy even 2 new tires if he could help out. The owner agreed to help, explaining that he'd need to ship in tires from another store, which would take a day or 2. 3 days later, I got a call that the tires were in. When I arrived after work, I was in for a surprise. The owner told me that they had ordered 4 new tires and would mount, balance, and install them at no charge. Stunned, I asked why he was doing this. He simply said that he wanted to help the widow and didn't want her to worry about something as trivial as a tire. He added that my payment would be to tell my friends about their shop. I was so moved, I almost cried. The next day, I called our local radio station. Their morning show was broadcast over half the state and parts of 3 others. I told them the whole story off air first. The radio host was incredulous and asked if they could share the story on air. I eagerly agreed. They told the story on air, praising the new shop and describing the bad one without naming names. But if you knew about the accident, you could easily figure out who the bad guy was. A few weeks later, I heard that the manager at the bad shop had been fired for fraudulence. Apparently, he had a habit of making up company policies as he saw fit. The broadcast had led to some serious changes in how the company managed its stores. I never expected my anger to lead to such a satisfying outcome. For years after, I told everyone I knew to go to the new shop. Even now, years later, and living in a different state, I'm still telling the story. It just goes to show when you have a chance to help someone in need, take it. You never know what kind of impact it might have. When I landed my dream job at a startup right out of college, I was thrilled to be working on cutting-edge projects, and the pay was great for a fresh graduate. Life was looking up, and I felt like I was on top of the world. About 6 months into my job, our team got a new manager. Let's call her Karen. Not her real name, of course. At first, everything seemed fine. She was friendly and seemed eager to get to know everyone. But it didn't take long for things to change. Karen started micromanaging everything we did. She'd constantly hover over our shoulders, asking for updates every hour. It was frustrating, but I tried to stay positive. I thought maybe she was just trying to prove herself in her new role. One day, I was working on a crucial project with a tight deadline. I had been putting in extra hours all week to make sure everything was perfect. As I was about to submit my work, Karen walked up to my desk. She told me to drop everything and work on a different project instead. I tried to explain that I was almost done with my current project, and it was due the next day. I asked if the new project could wait until I finished this one. Karen insisted that it couldn't wait, and that the new project was a priority. She demanded that I finish it by the end of the day. I was shocked. The new project she handed me would take days to complete properly. There was no way I could finish it in a few hours. I apologized and explained that it wasn't possible to complete the project in such a short time, saying it would take at least 3 days to do it right. Karen accused me of refusing to do my job and reminded me that she was my manager and was telling me what to do. I clarified that I wasn't refusing, just explaining that it wasn't physically possible to do what she was asking in the time frame she wanted. Karen rudely told me to figure it out, saying that's what she paid me for. She stormed off, leaving me stunned. I tried my best to work on both projects, but as expected, I couldn't finish the new one by the end of the day. The next morning, Karen called me into her office. She expressed her disappointment in my performance, pointing out that I hadn't completed the task she gave me the day before. I tried to explain again that it wasn't possible to complete that project in a few hours and that it required much more time to do it correctly. Karen dismissed my explanation as excuses and told me that she was putting me on a performance improvement plan. She suggested that if I couldn't handle the workload, maybe I wasn't cut out for the job. I was devastated. I had always received excellent performance reviews until Karen became my manager. I tried to talk to HR about the situation, but they seemed reluctant to get involved. They suggested I try to work things out with Karen. Over the next few weeks, Karen's behavior got worse. She started taking credit for my ideas in meetings and belittling me in front of my colleagues. My dream job had turned into a nightmare. One day, I overheard Karen talking to another manager in the break room. She was saying that she was trying to push me out because I was making too much money for a fresh graduate. She mentioned that if she could get rid of me, she could bring in 2 interns for the same price. All the unfair treatment suddenly made sense. She was deliberately trying to force me to quit or get fired. That's when I decided I wasn't going to let her win. I started documenting everything. Every unreasonable request, every instance of her taking credit for my work, every demeaning comment. I also reached out to some of my colleagues who had witnessed Karen's behavior. After gathering enough evidence, I went to the company's CEO directly. I knew it was a risky move, but I felt I had no other choice. I told him that I needed to talk about a serious issue with my manager, Karen. When he asked what the problem was, I laid out everything that had happened, showing him the documentation and emails from colleagues corroborating my story. I even mentioned the conversation I overheard about replacing me with interns. The CEO listened intently. When I finished, he was silent for a moment. Then he thanked me for bringing this to his attention, assuring me that this was not how they did things at the company. He promised to investigate the matter immediately. True to his word, the CEO launched an investigation. It turned out I wasn't the only one Karen had been mistreating. Several other employees came forward with similar stories. A week later, I was called into a meeting with the CEO and HR. I was nervous, unsure of what to expect. The CEO started by apologizing for what I've been through. He told me that they had concluded their investigation and that Karen had been terminated due to her completely unacceptable behavior. I was relieved but also worried about my position. I asked what would happen now. To my surprise, the CEO said they wanted me to stay with the company. He even mentioned that they were impressed with how I handled the situation and offered me a promotion to team lead with a significant pay raise. Not only was Karen gone, but I was being promoted. When I left the CEO's office, I saw Karen being escorted out of the building, box of personal items in hand. She glared at me as she passed. She threatened that I would regret this and that she would make sure I never worked in this industry again. I just smiled and walked away. I knew her threats were empty now. I'm glad I stood up for myself and didn't let Karen's behavior drive me away from a job I loved. And now we have reached the end of today's stories. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.